I bought the beach house 3 months ago, a quiet stretch of white walls and endless ocean that felt like the first real proof that I had built something on my own. When I sent my parents a photo of the keys, I didn't expect a celebration, but I didn't expect entitlement either. My mom replied, "Finally, now we'll have somewhere decent to spend summers." And my dad called to ask when they could start moving their things in, reminding me not to forget who raised me. Growing up, everything had always tilted in my siblings' favor, while I was told to be grateful, to work harder, to owe more. I left home at 19 with nothing and built my life without their help, and now that there was something valuable attached to my name, they suddenly spoke as if it belonged to them. By the end of the week, they were planning renovations and inviting guests, never once asking, only assuming. I didn't argue. I just listened, staring out at the ocean and realizing they were coming that weekend with luggage and expectations, completely unaware that this time, I wasn't the one about to be controlled. They arrived Friday afternoon like the coastline had been waiting for them. 2 SUVs pulling into the driveway, trunks packed heavier than a weekend visit required, my mother stepping out first with her sunglasses on, and that assessing look she used whenever she believed something now reflected her status, my father following behind her with the quiet authority he'd carried my entire childhood, already scanning the exterior as if calculating upgrades. They barely greeted me before walking inside, commenting on wall colors, furniture placement, the potential for expansion, speaking in we and ours instead of you and yours, and I let them talk, let them claim, let them assume, because I needed them comfortable before the shift. My mother stood in the living room and said the guest wing would become their permanent suite. My father suggested hosting business associates there during peak season. And when I calmly mentioned that no renovations or long-term stays would be happening, the temperature changed instantly. My father laughed once, short and dismissive, asking if I'd forgotten who helped shape me. And that was when I placed the folder on the marble counter between us, not dramatically, not angrily, just precisely. Inside was a clean copy of the deed, with my name clearly printed as sole owner, along with a formal occupancy agreement drafted by my attorney outlining visitor limits, property rules, and conditions for immediate removal if boundaries were crossed. My mother frowned as she skimmed the clauses, my father's jaw tightening with every line. And the silence that followed felt different from the ones in my childhood, because this time I wasn't shrinking inside it. He called it unnecessary, extreme, disrespectful, but I kept my voice steady and reminded him that clarity prevents conflict and ownership requires structure. When my mother said, "Were your parents?" I answered, "Yes, and you're welcome here as guests." And that single word shifted the balance of the room more than any raised voice could have. My father asked if I would really make them stay elsewhere if they refused to sign, and I told him I had already reserved a hotel nearby, just in case, watching realization settle across his expression as he understood this wasn't emotional rebellion but preparation. They had expected gratitude mixed with guilt, expected access without question, expected the same hierarchy we'd always lived under, but what stood in front of them now wasn't the quiet child who accepted imbalance. It was someone calm, legally protected, and finished negotiating her own worth. The ocean moved steadily beyond the glass doors, indifferent and powerful, and for the first time in my life the authority in the house wasn't inherited, it was earned, documented, and entirely mine. They didn't argue again after that night. They didn't apologize either, but something in their posture shifted, something subtle and undeniable, like they had finally realized the rules of the game were no longer written by them. They chose the hotel for the weekend, and I let them, not as a punishment, but as proof that access to my life now required acknowledgement, not assumption. We met for dinner the next evening at a quiet restaurant by the water, and the conversation was measured, almost cautious, my mother asking about my work with genuine curiosity instead of critique, my father listening more than speaking, as if recalibrating the authority he once carried so effortlessly. There were no renovation plans mentioned, no guest list proposed, no subtle reminders of sacrifice. Instead, there was a careful distance, the kind that forms when people realize a boundary is real. When dinner ended, my father paused before standing and said, "You've built something solid." And for the first time, it didn't sound like reluctant approval. It sounded like recognition. I thanked him calmly, not because I needed the validation, but because I could accept it without surrendering power. The next morning, they stopped by the house briefly, this time knocking before entering, and my mother complimented the simplicity of the design without suggesting changes, while my father stood quietly on the balcony looking at the ocean as if understanding that the view wasn't what impressed him. It was the independence behind it. Before they left, my mother hugged me longer than usual and said, "We didn't realize how serious you were," and I replied gently, "I am about my peace." There was no anger in my voice, no bitterness lingering in the air, just certainty. As their car disappeared down the coastal road, I walked back inside and closed the door softly, not to shut them out, but to remind myself that protection doesn't require noise. The house felt lighter, not because it had been heavy, but because the weight of expectation no longer pressed against its walls. I moved through each room slowly, noticing how different it felt to occupy a space that was fully mine, not just legally but emotionally, and I understood something that had taken me years to learn. Love without boundaries becomes control, and generosity without limits becomes entitlement. I hadn't cut them off. I had corrected the imbalance. I hadn't embarrassed them. I had educated them. There was no dramatic fallout, no screaming match, no slammed doors, just a quiet restructuring of access. Later that afternoon, my father sent a short message thanking me for dinner and saying they would coordinate future visits in advance. And I smiled at the word coordinate because it meant consult, and consult meant respect. I stood again on the balcony as the sun lowered into the horizon, the sky turning gold over the water, and realized the real welcome I had prepared wasn't the contract or the hotel reservation. It was clarity. Clarity that my success was not communal property. Clarity that adulthood meant ownership of both assets and boundaries. Clarity that I could love them without surrendering control. The ocean kept moving, steady and unapologetic, never asking permission to take up space. And I let that lesson settle into me fully. I didn't lose my parents that weekend, and they didn't lose a beach house. What changed was access, and access now required respect. In the end, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't seek revenge, and I didn't close my heart. I simply closed the door on entitlement and left it open for mutual understanding. They hadn't come to claim my house after all. They had walked into a boundary. And this time, the boundary held.